So we're going to start off with Jenny Poyer. Jenny is unironically a mum with an Etsy shop. While always politically engaged and has been and active, she has a degree in political science, and that's what she's into. She would never have made this much noise if she hadn't been backed into a corner by the shockingly effective online recruiting of her daughter by the TRAs. So thank you so much for coming and talking to us, Jenny, and over to you.
I think the best way into explaining, how I got here is to just read from the beginning of the chapter that I wrote for that book called Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria and its Discontents. So I'll start there. Imagine you've just hung a painting on your living room wall. You step back to take a look and realize it should be a few inches to the left. Just then, a neighbor pops in and tells you how to solve the problem. You must hire a builder to move the chimney, the door, and the windows a few inches to the right. Seeing your look of doubt, she calls other neighbors to weigh in. Enter the doctor, teacher, and therapist from down the street, each more emphatic than the last. Yes, rebuilding your house is the only way to center the painting. True, there will be a lengthy, costly period of mess and discomfort. The doorbell will never work again, and you might have to come and go through a window. These are but small concessions to the feeling of spatial congruence that awaits you. Should this happen to you, it will be perfectly clear that the neighbors, not you, have lost their minds. But this clarity will not resolve the isolation or the bewilderment you will experience in the aftermath. So I'll leave off there from the book. The chapter goes on to describe rapid onset gender dysphoria, what it is, and to give the reader an idea of how it impacts the family. I'm not a campaigner or what we call activist in the US by temperament. I haven't done a lot of marching, and when I have marched, I've never been the one carrying the big sign, much less making the speech. But I'm grateful for those who do carry the big sign and make the speech. But I never imagined that I would even do as much, speaking out about an issue that's controversial as I've done about this one. But it's so extraordinarily unique in so many ways that when it became an issue in my personal life and my family, it took me a few years really to kind of get my head around what we were really exploring here, which was a child at 13 saying that she was, now identifying as a member of the opposite sex. And this was before it was happening, in every other street, on every other block. And it really struck me as kind of the first time a young girl had ever come out as transgender, because I had only ever heard about the phenomenon, through the stories that I would hear on National Public Radio, which were pretty much always about trans women of color who, were disproportionately the victims of violence and bigotry in the culture. And, it seemed to me that this was a niche, type of predicament that one finds himself in. And it just didn't seem possible that it would ever really become like an active part of my everyday thoughts. But it became a very, all-encompassing interrogation that I kind of immersed myself in for about 5 years before I finally felt I actually really understand this thing, and I think I can start to explain it to people. And I started writing only to find out that there was no appetite for, for my version of this story. And there was just a big hole in the media in the US where the routine reporting on an issue like this should have been. So it took a couple more years before I finally came across WDI and had the opportunity to submit the chapter for this book, which I was thrilled to have accepted. And then once that happened, I began to find other outlets to publish my writing. But that hole in the information ecosystem is still very large, and it's very hard to break through and to figure out why it has to be that way in this country.
You became interested in this topic when your daughter told you she was a boy. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about it. It was 7 years ago, 2016, and she was 13, so she's 20 now. And as I said before, I hadn't heard of this happening to anyone else I knew, and my whole idea of what it meant to be transgender was really confined to those stories on NPR about trans women of color, and then a documentary that I'd seen years earlier about a couple of little kids who were identifying as transgender, and that was those were done. I think shortly after the Boston clinic opened in the United States, which was the first clinic that to offer so-called affirmative care to children in the United States. And in the period since then, between 2007 and today, there's now, I've heard estimates from 100 to 400, and it's crazy that I can't even tell you what that number is, but that's kind of a good example of the information vacuum that we deal with here, without an NHS and with a very, localized and profit-centered healthcare system, with this this sort of new treatment category added on to the healthcare system that we have. It doesn't exactly fit into a medical model, or at least it does what it fits into a medical model when doctors want to have their work covered, reimbursed by insurance companies. But it's quite separate from a medical model when activists want to persuade us that that there's nothing pathological about being transgender, and that there's it's not a problem in any way. It's not, except when it requires insurance coverage.
Yeah. And what did you seek or get any professional support or lack of support? What happened once you started engaging? And
the first kind of shock to my system was to realize that the structure, the school system, the faculty, the counselors, the teachers, support people had all somehow been trained, seemingly thoroughly trained in this aspect of, potential child need or presentation. That I'd never heard of this. I'd never known any of this training was happening in school. And I'd been pretty active as a parent volunteer. I'd been active in PTA legislative advocacy. It just seems like something I would have known if it had been the intention of the school district to include parents in this, in this understanding this new phenomenon that they were all getting in gear to apply, to children who might present with this unique problem. So I was informed that the only way they could react and the only way it would be appropriate for me and my husband to react to this announcement was to be affirmative, which meant to agree that our daughter was a boy and to use her pronouns and that the school would.
And this was 7 years ago. 7 years
Yes.
ago. Wow. Already. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't presented to us as, you know, it, I would say the approach from the school was as kind of warm and conciliatory as you can imagine, which made it, and these were people I knew pretty well and respected and trusted, and so it was just really kind of destabilizing to hear information from them that sounded so authoritative but made so little objective sense. So I sought the help of a behavioral child psychiatrist who I had kind of known in a social context. And, he is an older man, had been practicing for 30 years. This was the first, patient that he came across who had this transgender presentation. But it turned out, 3 years later, he had 3 or 4 more. But he did have sort of he had a more of a reasonable approach to it, but he did say that this is how, the entire profession is treating this presentation. This is what you can expect if you go to almost any therapist. And if you go to a gender clinic, they are very likely to tell you that there's only one course of treatment for this child. And, and it's not going to be, let's try to talk some sense into her and, and just tell her the truth and, get her interested in tennis or something, So luckily I never had any urge or, temptation to take her to the gender clinic, which would have been pretty close by at UC San Francisco, which is kind of the mothership on the West Coast of, together with UCLA, of sort of the craziest and most extreme applications of youth gender medicine.
And you managed to have a good relationship with your daughter all the way through this, which is quite an achievement. Or were there any moments when it was tricky?
There were moments. I mean, it would be fair to say there were months or even years where, it was very difficult to communicate about this. We are in a good place now. She's 20. She hasn't done any permanent harm to her body. She's not completely, separating herself from the ideology, but I do feel fairly confident that she's on the path to, maybe putting this in perspective and moving on.
One thing that I was going to ask you is about the WPATH guidelines, that you know about those, and what can you tell us about those WPATH, and can you tell us what WPATH is? What are those guidelines, and what do you think of them?
Yeah, WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Healthcare. WPATH, and I actually wrote a long article on my Substack about WPATH, and in the process, I learned things that I didn't know before. It's an organization that got its start in the middle of the last century as the Harry Benjamin. There's a long name, but the Harry Benjamin Institute for Transgender Healthcare. Harry Benjamin was an endocrinologist whose first famous patient was Christine Jorgensen, who in the US is known as the first transgender woman to come out and, and get a lot of notoriety for that. And then Harry Benjamin proceeded to transition a number of, other middle-aged men. And for a very long time, it was a very niche, very small cohort of people who had any interest in, appearing as the other sex. And they were all, at least grown, if not middle-aged men. Around the turn of the 21st century, WPATH, or the Harry Benjamin Institute, morphed into WPATH and became renamed as WPATH in the early 2000s. And it gradually, during that time, shifted from being a medical society with practitioners who had this niche interest in, helping a small number of, again, mostly men, successfully transition their appearance to that of a woman. They were beginning to offer a different protocol to children based on what's called the Dutch studies, based on some experiments that had been done around 1998 to early 2000s on an initial cohort of children 17 and under who were referred to the Amsterdam clinic to undergo a very specific protocol involving puberty blockers for the youngest ones, followed by cross-sex hormones, and then followed at 18 by surgeries, including genital surgeries. So the Dutch studies were promoted as as evidence that children could be transitioned, to the opposite sex, and that the advantage of doing this is that the problems encountered by adult transsexuals having to do with society not accepting them as being, the women that they wanted to present as, that the reasons that the society couldn't accept, their transitions, is because they didn't really look like women, and that the way to solve that problem would be to begin to change, bodies from the inside out with hormones by blocking puberty of patients young enough to prevent their ever developing secondary sexual characteristics. So Adam's apples, breasts, wider jaws, and all the things that we associate with identifiable sex markers. So so they got this cohort, the Dutch in Amsterdam, they got this cohort of 70 child volunteers to go through the whole protocol, and they had to conform to certain requirements, like no other comorbidities. So these couldn't be kids who had, anxiety or depression or, learning disabilities or any other, kind of, contributing factors to their distress. It had to be, children who were just simply distressed about feeling that they were born in the wrong body from as early an age as they were capable of communicating that. And then they had to have parents who were fully supportive of the idea of their, presenting as the opposite sex. So this was the cohort of children that the Dutch did its, experiments on, and the results were catastrophic by almost any measure. They actually killed one of these patients in the process of surgically, removing his genitals. He died from an infection directly from that surgery. A number of other patients developed diabetes as a result of their cross-sex hormones, which made them obese to the point that they were diagnosed with diabetic conditions that made it impossible for them to continue with the protocol and the surgeries. So they were out. And then a large number, I think it was like 15 of the 70, just simply were lost to follow-up, and this is in a matter of a couple of years. So kids, in other words, were so, like, I don't know if they were traumatized or harmed or in what way they were so disinclined to continue with the protocol that they wouldn't even talk to the clinicians who wanted to understand, what had happened to them, just so that they could complete the research. Okay, so 70 kids, 55 made it to the next, to the first marker where the first study was conducted to analyze how the patients were doing in the process of going from, entering the study, starting on the puberty blockers, and then proceeding to cross-sex hormones. So 15 were lost to follow-up or otherwise disabled by the process. So the initial study reported that, notwithstanding the ones that we can't tell you about because they're just gone, but the rest of them seemed to be doing great. And that was based on, basically a customer satisfaction survey where they asked the kids if they were feeling more like the desired sex, and the kids said yes, they were. And so everything was going great. So then they get to the next place where now they're doing surgeries on these kids. One of them dies, and another number fall off the program for the reasons I've just described, and now 32 are left at the end who can be said to have completed the protocol. So they go from 70 to 32, and then they take these 32 survivors and they ask them how everything's going for them, and lo and behold, it's going great. So only recently has it been reported that the evidence that those 32 patients were doing well came from surveys that had literally been switched, so that at the beginning of the survey, if you were a young boy who entered the protocol, you would have been asked a series of questions that you were supposed to answer on a scale of 1 to 10. How strongly you felt about this issue. So you would have been asked to rate the statement, "I hate getting erections because they remind me that I'm a boy." And then you would have had to, give that a number. Well, after it was all said and done, now the Dutch researchers have declared that you are now a woman. And so they give you the questionnaire that was written for the young girls who entered the study, and you were now asked to respond to the question, "I hate menstruating because it reminds me that I'm a girl." So in other words, like, even the survey, tool that they used to measure whether the remaining patients who had survived and were, lived to tell the tale and still even wanted to, was a survey that couldn't possibly deliver the information they even said they were seeking. So it was, I'm not a scientist or a researcher, of any kind. I'm just reading this and thinking, how does this study even, how do these people, how does the clinic stay open, after doing this kind of research? But not only do they stay open, but, the reports from this Dutch protocol actually became the basis. It is called the gold standard by WPATH, which now is the activist organization that makes all of the decisions about standards of care for trans identifying patients of any age, anywhere in the world. And essentially, those guidelines, I know you asked about WPATH, and I kind of went on a tangent,
Yeah.
but as far as the quote unquote gender affirming care of children in at least in the United States is concerned, the WPATH standards of care that are the most recent, number 8, they call it SOC 8, now recommend that there be no requirements for a child patient to be any particular age to undergo surgeries, what they call top surgery, which is cosmetic double mastectomy, or genital surgeries. So progressively, as these standards have been revised every few years, the requirements have just gotten more and more, open.
Yeah, it's
Less
terrible.
and less restrictive. Sorry, go ahead.
It's getting worse. I mean, it seems to be getting worse and worse, and only the professions are who are still going along with this. It's really, really appalling. Well, Jenny, what do you think should happen now? And is there anything that women watching could do, or what would you suggest that women do now?
We need to be talking about this. I think we need to be in the U.S. We need to be asking our elected leaders, specific questions about their assessment of this situation and whether they think, whether they even have any idea of what's really happening, whether they feel that they have a role in establishing regulations or even just bringing the conversation out into the open. It's very polarized in the U.S. It's become very much a subject that if you belong to my party, if you're a liberal voter and you're a Democrat, you're supposed to believe the opposite of what I believe. So again, it's a destabilizing, place to be, and it's a difficult conversation to have, even with just social acquaintances, and it's just it's like a third rail. However, we got to start talking about it, because nothing changes until people become aware of what's really happening, and the fact that medical experiments on children that are harming them and sterilizing them are not a political issue.